In this section, we are going to learn one of the most powerful features in Excel, pivot tables. If you work with large data sets and want quick summaries, comparisons, and insights without writing complex formulas, pivot tables are an essential skill. A pivot table is a data analysis tool that allows you to summarize, analyze, and reorganize large amount of data dynamically. Instead of using multiple formulas like SUMIF or VLOOKUP, pivot tables help you get insights in just a few clicks. We will be discussing pivot table features in detail in this section. Thank you. Let us first understand the data which we will use to create the pivot table. So here is the data sheet. If we press Control and right arrow key, so the data extends from column A to column U. And if I press the Control and down arrow key, we see that this data is till the row 9995, so around 10,000 rows of data. The data has the order ID, order dates, shipment date, shipment mode, customer ID, customer name. Then we have the segment, the country, city, state, postal code, region, product ID, product category, subcategory, name of the product, sales, quantity, discount, and profit. So we have a large amount of data, and we will be using this data to understand how we can quickly create a pivot table to do the data analysis. Before inserting a pivot table, we have to ensure that the data is in proper format. The first thing to check is that there shouldn't be any empty rows or columns. The second thing to check is that all the columns should have the headers. These headers will appear in the field list in the pivot table. And the third thing to check is that there shouldn't be any totals or subtotals in between. If there are any totals or subtotals in between, then the pivot table will do a double counting and our data analysis will be impacted. Once we ensure that all the three conditions are met, we can work on the pivot table. So, in the next video, we will understand how we can quickly create a pivot table and start our data analysis. Thank you. To insert a pivot table, we can select the entire data range or click anywhere in this table and then click on Insert Pivot Table. When we click on Pivot Table, it asks whether we want to create the pivot table from a data or range or from an external data source. So in this case, we are creating this pivot table from a data range. So I'll click here. Now this screen pops up and it shows the area selected, which is cell A1 to U9995, which means that the entire data set has been selected. It is also asking whether we want to insert the pivot table in a new worksheet or the existing worksheet. So we usually insert a pivot table in a new worksheet when it is a first pivot table. If we have more than one pivot tables, then we can insert those pivot tables in the existing worksheet where we have all the pivot tables. Cancel it now, and then before inserting the pivot table, let us first convert this data into an Excel table. To convert this data into an Excel table, we'll press Ctrl and T. So this selects the entire data range and then click on OK. Now the data has been converted into an Excel table. We can change the formatting of the Excel table. We select any cell on the data table. The table design tab appears at the top, and we have a few designs over here. So we can select this design. So now this data is in a table format. Now we'll insert the pivot table. So we'll click on Insert Pivot Table from Table or Range. So we see that instead of giving the entire range, it is giving the name of the table. So the name of the table is table 2, which is selected. We'll insert the pivot table in a new worksheet and click OK. So once we click on OK, so we have the pivot table report range, which is on the left. and then pivot table fields on the right. In the pivot table fields, we have the column headers which we had in our data table. If we click outside of the pivot report range in any cell, the pivot field list goes away. So let's click on the pivot report range. So here we have the column headers in the same order as the columns. So we can change the order from A to Z. So to change the order, we can click on the tools over here and then select sort A to Z. Now it is sorted in alphabetical order. So let's see what happens when we select any field. In the pivot field list, we have the option to drag the field from the field list into a column, row, or values. So let's select the sales and drag it in values. So when we drag the sales in the values, sum of sales appears in the pivot table. So this is not formatted. So we can format this by right clicking on the number, and then here we have format cells. We can select the number, use the thousand separator, remove the decimals and click OK. So now we have the formatted sales, which is more than 2 million. If we select the region and drag it in the rows, we have the sales by regions. So we have four regions: central, east, south, and west. And we also have the sum of sales for each of these regions. If we want the sales by segment, we can click on the segment. So now we have the sum of the sales by the region and by the segment. So there are three segments in the data set: consumer, corporate, and home office. We have the sales for each region and each segment. We can also play with the appearance of the pivot table. So if I want the segments in the columns, I can just drag and put it in the columns. Now we have the regions in the rows and the segment in the columns. We also have the grand totals. So by the regions and by the segments. If we want to remove the grand totals, so we can click on design, and then on the left we have the grand total. So we can select any of the options. So let's say on for rows only. So now the grand total for the segments go away. We can bring it back by clicking on the pivot table, design, and in grand total on for rows and columns. So now we have the grand total for each of the regions and each of the segments. If we want the revenues by the state, we can click on the state, and now we have the revenues for each region, state, and the segment in our data set. So it's just click, plug and play. So whatever data we want, we just have to select that data and move it in the field list. If we don't want the state, we can select the state, and we have a drop down over here. We can select remove field setting. If we want to bring it back, we can click on state and it comes back. We can also drop it outside of the field. So there's a cross sign which means that the field is removed. If we want to change the appearance, let's say we want the revenues by region, by segment, and then we want the revenues for the state also. We can put the state in columns. So we see that we have the revenue by region and by state, but this doesn't look good. So we can quickly move the state below the regions and segment in the columns. Now we have the table as we had before. We can also move the fields up or down. So if we want the state first and region next, we can move it above the region. So now we have the states and the regions. So we'll move back the regions first and then the state because it looks better. There is a lot of flexibility in pivot table on how we want to analyze our data. In the next video, we'll see some more options on how we can quickly analyze data from the pivot table. Thank you. Let us understand a few more features in the pivot table. So before doing that, Let me remove the state and the segment. So we have the sales for each of the four regions and the total sales. Now, if we want to calculate the percentage of sales contributed by each of the regions, what we can do is we can move this sales field once again in the values section. So now we have the sales twice, and what we can do is we can right click on this sales. We have an option to show the values as percentage of grand total. So we can select this, and now we have the total sales and percentage sales contributed by each of the regions. We can change the name of this column from sum of sales to percentage revenues. So we can click over here or maybe type percentage revenues, or we can right click and then select value field settings, change the name of the column to average revenues. Click OK. So now the name has again changed to average revenue. Let me remove this field from here and let's select the profit. The moment we click on profit, we have a new field named values appearing in the column section. So this values basically controls the values in this section. Now what we can do is we can add the product category. So we click on the category, and now we have the revenue and profits for each region and each category. We can move this category to the columns. So for each category, we have the sum of sales and sum of profit. We can change the order. So if we move these values down and categories first, so now we have each category of the product where we have the total revenues and total profit. We can also change the sum to some other metric. So if I click on value field setting, so we have the option to show the sum of the revenue and sum of profit, which is the default option. But we can also change it to average, maximum, minimum. So let's say if I change this to average and click OK. So now we have the average profit for each transaction. Or we can do a count also. So we'll select value field setting, click on count and OK. So now we have the count of each of the transactions, and the total transactions for this data set is 9994. Let me do the sum calculation again. So we'll click on value field setting, sum, and then OK. So now we have the sum of the profits. If we move the category to the rows, we have the numbers for each region and each category. We can add one more field. So if we want to add the subcategory, for each category, we have the subcategory where we have the total revenue and total profits. So there are multiple ways in which we can plug and play with the options given in the pivot table. Let's now explore how we can use the filter. So if we want to filter the data for each state, so what we can do is we can click on the state, and instead of showing it in a row, we can drag it to the filters. So now there is a filter at the top. So currently the data is for all the states. We can select a particular state. So if we want to select the first state, Alabama, and click OK. So now we have the region, which is the South region, the segment, and the category of the product for this state. We can also select multiple states. So I'll click on the filter. Here we have the option to select multiple items. So when I click over here, there are check boxes before each name. So we can select the states we want. So if I select Alabama, Florida, and Georgia and click OK, so now we have the data for these three states. So this is how we can use the filter in the pivot table. There are many more options which you can explore in the pivot table. Thank you. Pivot table slicers are visual filtering tools that allows users to filter pivot table data using clickable buttons. Slicers make filtering pivot tables faster, clearer, and more attractive. Before inserting a slicer, let us remove the filter which we inserted in our previous video. So let me click on this drop down and remove the field. Similarly, we will remove the region and the category of the products. Now, what we have is the subcategory of the product, the sum of sales, and sum of profit. To insert a pivot table slicer, click anywhere on the pivot table. So once we click on the pivot table, we will get a tab called Pivot Table Analyze. So we click on Pivot Table Analyze, and here we have the option to insert a slicer. So we'll click on Insert Slicer. Here we can select the options we want. So what we will select over here is we will select the category of the product and region and click OK. So what we have over here is the category, the three categories: furniture, office supplies, and technology, and four regions: central, east, south, and west. When we click on the slicer, this slicer tab appears on the screen. So we can change the design of the slicer by clicking over here and maybe select this design, and also can change the appearance of the slicer, meaning changing the size or column by using these options. So let me select the region slicer, and here we have one column. We can change the number of columns to 4 and then drag and increase the size of the slicers horizontally and then shrink it vertically. So we can change the size color of the slicer the way we want. Now let's see what a slicer does. In the slicer, we have the option to select one region and one category, or multiple regions and multiple categories. Currently, we have the furniture and the south region selected, so the data is filtered accordingly. We can select all the four regions by clicking on this clear filter button. So when we click here, all the four regions are selected and the data changes accordingly. We can also select multiple category of products by pressing the control key on our desktop or keyboards and then select two categories. So when I press control key and then select the category I want, so we have furniture and office supplies selected now for all the four regions. Let's select the central region. So furniture and office supply revenues and profits for the central region. If I want for central and south region, I can press the control key on my keyboard and then press south. So now we have the revenues for central and south region for furniture and office supplies. Now let us learn how we can insert a timeline in our slicer. So to insert a timeline slicer, we will click on the pivot table and then click on pivot table analyze and select insert timeline. So it is asking for order date and shipping date. So we'll select shipping date and click OK. So now we have this timeline. So where we have the data for each of the years. Now we can filter the data by region, by category, and by the shipment date or shipment year. So if we select this timeline slicer, we can filter the data for each period. Here we have the drop down. So we have the option to convert this timeline to quarters, month, year, or days. So let's see what happens if we click on quarters. Now we have the option to select the data by quarter. So if I want to select the data for Q1 2016, so we have the data for the central and southern region for furniture and office supplies for Q1 2016. We can also select the data for the entire period. So we can clear the filter, and what it does, it selects the data for the entire period. So let me clear all the filters we have currently for the region, category, and shipment date. Now, if I want to select the data for any particular month, I can choose the month feature also here and then select the data for a particular month. So this again is a very interactive tool and a very flexible option given in Excel to filter the data for each of the category, product, region, state, city, or by the dates. It can be order date or shipment date, the way we want. Since it is just a few clicks, we don't have to enter complicated formulas while filtering data in the pivot table. Thank you. Welcome back. Let us quickly understand how we can refresh the pivot table data. So currently we have the total revenues of $2.3 million dollars for all the four regions and for all the periods combined. So let's see what happens if we change the pivot table data. So this table has the pivot table data, and the first row has revenues of $48. So let's say we change the number from $48 to 1 million. Now, if we go back to the pivot table, we see that the numbers have not updated automatically. To refresh the data in the pivot table, we have to right click on the pivot table and then select refresh. Once we click on refresh, this data gets updated. So the revenue of 2.3 million has now updated to 3.3 million. Let's see what happens if we change the data back to the original data. So if I change the sales number again to $48, go to the pivot table. Again, the pivot table data has not updated automatically. So what again we have to do is right click on the pivot table and then click on refresh. So now we have the original sales number. There is no direct way in which pivot table data gets updated automatically. In the next section, when we discuss the dashboards, we will see that we can update the pivot table data automatically by using macros. But apart from that, we don't have any other option how we can update the pivot table data automatically. Thank you.